Where's her hand? It's amazing how many of my friends have come over to my house and noticed that my statue of Mary is missing her hand. You see, what had happened is I received a phone call from the Tower Theater. They were going to be putting on late night catechism, and the Holy Name sister who was putting on late night catechism forgot her statue of Mary, and the Tower Theater wanted to know if they could borrow my statue of Mary, assuming because I was Catholic that I would have a statue of Mary. And so I said, sure, and they sent a guy over, and I had Mary all wrapped up in cloth and bubble wrap and a nice bag and everything else, and he arrived with 2 complimentary tickets to the show at the Tower Theater. So I got to go see Late Night Catechism. I'd never seen Late Night Catechism before. Basically, it's in a classroom setting where this Holy Name sister is teaching catechism to adults at night. And so the play is just a real fun look at what catechism could be like. Although some of the things were very thought-provoking, because she had felt boards. I guess felt boards were a really fun thing that sisters like to play with. So she had felt boards. One was a felt board of heaven. One was a felt board not of heaven. And in the center was a felt board with all these people on it. So she said, for audience participation, of all these people, who do you think is going to heaven? Well, let me tell you, Mother Teresa was the first one taken off that board and put on the heaven one. And so they went through and they added a small number of people to heaven. And it made me ask myself the question, who do you think is going to heaven? Why? What are we using to determine which of these people are going to heaven? Who is going to heaven and why? So it was a very thought-provoking exercise. But then she asked, and who do you think is not going to heaven and why? And I was just frightened by the number of people that were coming off the board going to not heaven. And I thought to myself, we are so lucky that that audience is not God, because there would be a lot of people not ending up in heaven if that audience was the ones in charge. But I want you to think to yourself, who do you think is going to heaven? Why? Who do you think is going to heaven? Why? Who do you think is not going to heaven? Why? It was something that I was confronted with when a long time ago I heard this joke. And I put the joke in your church bulletin. And for those of you who are watching live stream, it's on our website if you want to share this joke with others. So I heard this joke. St. Peter was giving a tour of heaven to a Methodist elder. No, when I originally heard the joke, it wasn't a Methodist elder, so I changed it up just a little bit. We're not talking about him, though, okay? We're not talking about Reverend David. So, St. Peter was giving a tour of heaven to a Methodist elder. Heaven's infinite awesomeness had kept the elder speechless up to that point, but she just had a question that had to be asked. As they were going through heaven, she had been amazed with who was there and how many were there. To say that she was surprised by some she saw would be an understatement. And yet, she just couldn't understand why they were now walking along a massive wall. The wall seemed to be incongruous with heaven's openness. The elder finally had the courage to speak up. St. Peter, Why is there a wall in heaven? It seems so out of place. Shh, keep your voice down, replied St. Peter. The Catholics are on the other side, and we don't want them to hear you because they think they're the only ones up here. And boy, did I laugh at that joke. I was laughing and laughing and laughing, then I came to realize, wait a minute, the joke's on me. The joke's on me because I remember going to my CCD classes, and we would say our prayers at CCD classes, and we would pray for the poor Protestants down the street not going to heaven. Imagine as a child praying for these poor Protestants down the street not going to heaven. But then what was amazing is my mother put me in a Missouri-Synod Lutheran vacation Bible school during the summer. And guess what? They prayed for the Catholics who weren't Christians, so they weren't going to heaven. And I thought, obviously not many people are going up to heaven. I mean, the only thing that they had right is that they were praying. I mean, I think it's good to pray, but their motivation just made me think, who is going to heaven and why? Who is not going to heaven? The reality is, it is God's desire that everyone goes to heaven. That's what is God's desire. In our first reading from the book of Sirach, chapter 35, verse 12, in one of the translations, the Lord knows no favorites. The Lord knows no favorites. Who is going to heaven and why? Well, we're very fortunate that God is a very forgiving and merciful God. And in that forgiveness and mercy, we know that God desires for us to be in heaven. And so we have to constantly ask ourselves, what role does God's mercy have in this decision? Well, in my sinful life, it has an awful lot to do with that decision. Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner. Isn't that what we heard in the Gospel of Luke chapter 18, verse 13 to 14? The tax collector stood off at a distance and would not even raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast and prayed, "Oh God, be merciful to me, a sinner." I tell you, the tax collector went home justified, not the Pharisee. We have to ask ourselves the question, how do you think our attitude and behavior influences decision? Because what was the attitude of the Pharisee? Oh my goodness, was that guy stuck on himself? So much so that who did he pray to? Did you hear how it was put in the gospel? Who did he pray to? Himself. I'm so glad I'm not like all the other people who are out there. I mean, especially this tax collector. Well, I'm glad he was praying to himself because I don't think God really wanted to hear that kind of prayer. But who did God listen to? The tax collector. Oh God, be merciful to me, a sinner. You see, the reality is, in our journey to heaven, we need to focus on what is our attitude and behavior. To focus on what is our attitude and behavior, because I believe that's the only thing that keeps people from going to heaven is their attitude. If they got the attitude that they don't need to pray to God, they can pray to themselves. They could do it all on their own. They don't need God. And their behavior, the overly judgmental, put down, labeling behavior. I believe that's the only thing that keeps people from heaven is attitude and behavior. So let's focus on what's our attitude. What's our behavior? And then live it in such a way that we can help others in their attitude and behavior. So not judge others or put others down, but build them up. Help them on the journey to heaven. Help them to experience God's mercy for people who know they need God's mercy. Help them to know that God shows no favorite. It's God's desire for everyone to get into heaven, for everyone to get into heaven. It's not always easy, but we seek God's mercy and we witness that mercy to others in our attitude and our behavior. I had to witness it. So the Tower Theater was finally done with my statue of Mary after late night catechism. And they returned it to me. And I unwrapped her from the bubble cloth. I unwrapped her from the cloth. And her hand was missing. Imagine the delightful person who received my phone call when I called the Tower Theater and I said, "Can you check Lost and Found for me and see if you can find a hand?" A what? A hand. My lost her hand. And if I'm wondering if somebody turned in her hand. No, they said. Nobody gave us a hand.